and it's Good Friday. Death was a given. It was inevitable. It was a non-negotiable. Death was part of the plan. Death was the plan. Death was the point of the incarnation. It was the planned crescendo ending, even as he took his first breath out of Mary's womb. Multiple scriptural evidence tells us that the death of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, was for us and in our stead, a substitutionary death on a grand scale, even as he died a literal substitutionary death when he replaced a famous prisoner, Jesus Barabbas, who walked free. There are many ways to die in the death and dying chapter of human experience. He didn't die as a baby when the entire population of baby boys of Bethlehem was murdered by Herod. He didn't die of old age. He didn't die of a diagnosed grave illness. He didn't die accidentally as a result of an unfortunate mishap in his father's wood workshop. He didn't die fighting in a war. He didn't die from malnourishment, leprosy, or a heart attack. He didn't die like his cousin John, quickly beheaded, privately presumably, and then having his head plated and paraded at a birthday party. The triune God decided that the death of the Son of God should be public, very public. A public execution spectacle, really. The manner of that public spectacle in that particular moment of time was the cross. It's hard for us to grasp all the elements involved in a public death because we just don't have anything similar in our immediate experience. Although in some places in the world this sort of dying as a public spectacle is still being arranged today. But it is in a sharp contrast to our civilized world. When we think of a public death, we perhaps think of one in a hospital setting, surrounded not just by the loved ones, but in an assortment of medical professionals, whose main priority is comfort and minimizing pain. In contrast to Jesus' public spectacle death, the atmosphere of such a dying process, and as a hospital chaplain I witnessed a few, is caring and compassionate, filled with kindness. None of the people watching this video will die or witness death as a public spectacle. But the likelihood of either was so much greater throughout history. Those who saw this Friday afternoon crucifixion were very likely to see another one again, and some evidence points that at least some of the disciples present there died a similar public spectacle death themselves. So this was an ordinary, commonplace public spectacle. Even that Friday's afternoon death schedule had 3 people on it. In dying a public death, Jesus became one more number in the sea of people who have experienced it, either at the center of it or as spectators of it. And as I am not just Gal pastor, I'm also Gal historian, I am here to read historical gore, G-O-R-E, so you don't have to. Or is it so that you would want to? Either way, I'm going to read you an excerpt from Engaging the Passion, Perspectives on the Death of Jesus, a collection of essays, and I'm going to read from The Passion in Christian Liturgy, an essay by Robert Atwell. Crucifixion was a terrible reality that confronted people on an almost daily basis in first century Palestine, because it was part of the machinery of repression of the Roman state. You could not have traveled around the country for very long without coming across pitiful procession of prisoners, dragging crossbars to the places of execution. Contrary to majority of paintings depicting the crucifixion, the crosses to which the naked victims were nailed were in fact only about 7 feet tall. At that height, it was easy for passers-by to mock the helpless victims who were hanging just above their heads. The Romans thought of every form of degradation. And also from A Day in the Life of Ancient Rome by Alberto Angela in English translation. The Romans, in short, belonged to a world very different from our own. You don't say. The Colosseum was the place for public executions, something which continued to exist in our society until very recent times. France had the guillotine, England the gallows, and every time the execution was held in front of a crowd as a warning. In the Rome of the Papal State, after Jesus, there were several places for public executions, each with its own prescribed method. In the Campo de' Fiori, heretics were burned at the stake. In Trastevere, the condemned person's hands were cut off. Castel St. Angelo was the place for hangings, quarterings, and decapitations. In Piazza del Popolo, executions, which were often included as part of the Mardi Gras celebrations, were conducted in a truly horrifying manner. Victims were hammered to death. To be sure, the Romans did something that no one had ever done before: transform torture into spectacle. Again, an untold number of such deaths throughout history, some as part of the justice system, some as deterrents for revolutionaries or other political enemies. I have a friend whose great-grandmother, after seeing a war movie on TV for the first time, exclaimed in horror, "How many people had to die for this movie to be made?" She wasn't too far off. There are plenty of examples in history of public death as entertainment. Think of gladiators. There's plentiful historical evidence that there were reenactments of mythological and folklore stories and legends that frequently ended in death for the entertainment of elite and/or masses. Indeed, an entire literary genre emerged, a martyrology, volumes upon volumes of nauseatingly rich history of human public killings on account of their faith, often illustrated. Like with every other detail of Jesus' life, there was a careful intentionality on part of the triune God when entering the entire human experience. Jesus was born at that time to partake even of that historically common human death experience, and partake of it to the max. And in that, he was intentionally identifying with an undeniably huge segment of humans, however remote from our experience, that suffered and died an arguably worst possible death, a public spectacle. Whatever was done to his body in order to make it stop living was done publicly. What sort of a thing do you have to do to a body of a healthy 30-something-year-old man to kill him? The entire process of dying of the Son of Man was public. There is an immediate momentary theological significance here, as the similar public ritual killing was taking place nearby at the temple courts, with countless Passover lambs dying at the same time. We can also recognize the necessity, so to speak, for a public death. There is an element of witnessing here. There were witnesses at birth, shepherds and magi. Here we also need an undeniable validation that this particular death of unparalleled significance, the death of an incarnate God, indeed took place. Some might say such public death had to occur to fulfill what was prophesied. Gospel writers, Matthew in particular, state that about many events in Jesus' life. But his life was not predetermined by what the prophecies foretold about him. This didn't happen so that the narrative wouldn't stray from what was predicted in the past. Jesus' storyline was not beholden to persons who spoke about it in bits and pieces at a previous moment in time. No, the story was planned like that. The author of the entire narrative wrote the whole story before the beginning of time. And perhaps the closest Old Testament scriptures that talk about this experience of a public spectacle death is found in Psalm 22, told from the dying person's point of view. I memorized it this year in my preparation for Lent, and it took some emotional bandwidth entering that experience. I sort of agonized through it while committing it to memory and trying not to lose my sanity. It is very heavy. It's describing physical, mental, and spiritual torment of being killed publicly. It's referencing in really vivid terms what it would be like to be surrounded by people while dying in anguish. What it would feel like to have others mocking you and your relationship with God. What it would feel like to have others fighting over your clothes that you will not need ever again. What it would feel like to look around and instead of people, see beastly, deranged predators surrounding you. You've read possibly before of the mechanics involved in crucifixion and how it suffocates the body to death in time. This psalm describes the slow process, recording poetically many a painful physical change. When in Gospels Jesus starts his journey to Jerusalem, to his public death, Mark describes him as distressed, agitated, and grieved. In Matthew 26, Jesus says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." This marks just the beginning of unimaginable psychological agony and spiritual turmoil that will go on alongside the physical extinguishing of his life publicly. The toll of gradual, prolonged physical violence coupled with public humiliation, fear, dehumanization, loss of control, deprivation, sense of defeat, the utter exhaustion of frail body followed by the demise of a troubled mind. If you walked with someone that you took care of till death, you know that psychological agony can be even worse than physical. The oncoming death, especially if there is prolonged suffering involved, defeats the human spirit, not just the body. That's how death prevails, by slaying the whole person, body and mind. In the theatrically dramatic telling of the events surrounding the crucifixion, as told by the Gospel writers, many different characters appear, act, and speak. The soldiers, the other two who happened to be part of the public spectacle that day, Jesus' friends and loved ones. An assortment of sorrowful and sympathizing onlookers. And you can imagine perhaps the pitiful state of the loved ones there, the sickening choice before them to stay, watch, and endure, or leave him feeling alone and abandoned. But it is clear that there is a contingent of people there under that cross, those crosses, that don't have to be there. They're there to spectate, gawk, humiliate, hurl insults, and they're also referenced in Psalm 22. There were those who were given a job of executions, of whom some possibly used the job description as an outlet to enact the worst of their own depravity, as they possibly reveled in their official license to withhold mercy and inflict mortal suffering. But there were possibly those doing their job who were not psychos like that. Perhaps the professing centurion was one of those. Public spectacle death is by definition a participatory event. If you are there to witness it, you are drawn in one way or another. There is no neutrality. As a reader, you are struck by this public spectacle, this freak show of humanity. What you see there is a shocking normalization of horrendous human cruelty. That scene that Friday afternoon is so strikingly indicative of the utter brokenness of humanity. But there is more. As a reader, you are emotionally and really existentially drawn into this public spectacle. When you realize that the very core of your faith is informed and sustained by this particular manner of his death. How different would your faith be if he hadn't died like this, but any one of the aforementioned deaths? You would not know the same Jesus as the one you get to know on that cross. Indeed, you need this death to take place. Unlike those present to witness this public extinguishing of life, you know something else about it. Most of them thought they were watching a public spectacle death. You know that what you are watching is a public spectacle of his love. The author of the entire narrative wrote in this public spectacle death for you since the beginning of time. I don't know if any of us can even begin to understand how that can be so. How God made this brutal public event at the same time the most preeminent communication of God's love in the entire story of this broken humanity. But that's the Good Friday. It's in its entirety a public spectacle of God's love for you.